unless she came to the, the busing one last night. But, who is this their first Dragon Con? Wow. Wow. Well, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us on the Urban Fantasy Fan Track. Now, for those of you who are brand new, I'm going to explain a few things. Those of you who have been here before, how many of you have been to Urban Fantasy before? Fantastic. So those of you who have come before are aware of our Battle of the Fandoms. This is for the DragonCon charity. This is how we participate every year, is the Battle of the Fandoms. This table over here, you will see lots of colored little containers with names on the front of the fandoms. These are all of the shows that Urban Fantasy covers. So the way this works is if you want your particular favorite show to win the Battle of the Fandoms by the end of con, then you vote. And how you do that is you put either little shinies or things that fold in the buckets. It's tallied every day, so we have a running tally of who's in the lead. That way, the next day, somebody can say, "Oh no, that's not the one it should be," and they can vote more the next day. And then by the end of con, we'll figure out who won the Battle of the Fandoms. We've had, in the last couple of years, we had the Librarians win, we've had Lost Girl win. Who was it last year?
Last year was...
I don't remember. I don't remember last year. It wasn't the Librarians, so I didn't say. It wasn't. I was like, we had a thing, the librarians won the first that 1 year, and we got in touch with somebody who's got in touch with management with librarians said if they want to get a second year, they would donate something from the set, and the librarians came second last year. I was very sad, and we don't have librarians this year, so if you don't have a favorite, you can just select one, or you can go with.
I recommend iZombie.
No. I'm sorry. It's all about the hotness. Lucifer has to win. It's Lucifer this year, people. We got Judy Woodside here. Come on. But you anytime, put money in here, and I will let Jennifer take it from here. Hello.
My name is Jennifer, and I get to start a conversation with all of you lovely people about contemporary vampires. So I imagine that that's all why you're here, so we'll get to that. I'm going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves and kind of give you just a very brief introduction, and then I have some questions. And we'll go through that in about 15 minutes before we finish up. We'll start asking questions from the audience. So if you think of anything that you would like to know or anything you want us to expand upon from previous discussions or whatever, just be prepared to ask. And we might, thanks to one of our panelists and some lovely friends, have some prizes for people who ask questions. So be thinking about things that you might want to know. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started with the introductions first, and then we'll get into the questions and have some fun discussion. So if we want to start here, we'll work our way down.
All right, my name is Clay Gilbert. I write science fiction, horror, urban fantasy. I've published 11 novels, and I've been a vampire fan for a long time. It's one of the reasons I'm up here, and I've written a couple of vampire novels. This is one of them, called Cassie's Song. I volunteered for the horror track with Derek Tatum for about 10 years, and now I'm here. So it's good to be here with everybody. And
Hi, I'm Rachel. I write under R.E. Carr, and yes, this is my very first con and my very first panel. I have written 8 novels. I write in urban fantasy and science fiction, and my first novel was a 2015 Kindle Scout winner. So, wait, you gotta tell me the whole thing. How many Kindle Scout winners? 3. And this is Lisa, and she's going to talk now.
Hi, my name is Lisa Manifold. I write I just published my 24th novel. And I didn't get into vampires. I love vampires, but I didn't get into them until this year, so this was novel 24. Sex in my chest. Both of my vampire novels are paranormal romance, but that's it.
I'm J.F. Lewis. The J stands for Jeremy, the F stands for something else. And I write books that get me into trouble, among them the Void City series and my epic fantasy series, The Breadbird Trilogy.
Hi, I'm Mary Mancusi. This is my 11th drag con, so that's exciting. I have written 26 books for kids, teens, and adults, so I do a little bit of everything, right? Recently I've been writing for Disney. I do Arthurian time travel series, Camelot Code, The Once and Future Geek was my last book out. But I did a lot of vampire books over the years, especially during that mid-2000 heyday of YA vampires, and I did a 8-book YA vampire series for Penguin called Boys That Bite, The Blood Coven Vampires. It went out of print, but I republished them on Amazon, which is so awesome that you can do that now, and take those old books, and I kind of updated it, like all the pop culture references and stuff, and put it back on, and then I did like a spin-off of the series Once Upon a Vampire. And it was so great because I'm sure we'll get into this on the panel, but just briefly, as you know, the traditional media publishing is not super keen on vampires right now. Maybe it's coming back, we might be on the threshold, but there are so many readers who love vampires, so I'm so thankful for the opportunity that authors can still bring books of vampires to the people who want them.
My name is Declan Finn. I am the author of 20 published novels. We won't get into the ones that are still coming. 5 of those books have come out in the last 12 months. I have written 4 vampire novels. 2 of them got Dragon Award nominations in year 1 and 2, if we're being picky. And I got into vampires because I got sick and tired of vampires I didn't like. So it's like, screw this, I'm going to do it my own way. I have written urban fantasy, I have written thrillers, and I'm currently writing either urban fantasy or horror. That depends on what you consider. That depends on how much gore you want in your horror.
Okay, so before we get into the differences between traditional and contemporary vampires, why don't we start with why each of you thinks that vampires are able to make that transition? What is it about vampires that keeps them, like Mary said, people keep wanting to read them? Why? What is it about them that allows them to be so adaptable through different time periods and different settings and different genres? And what is it about it exactly that makes it still something that you want to write and that you think people want to read? And we'll go ahead and start down at the end and work our way back this way.
Oh, okay. In large part, I think because they are so flexible. Read all of our vampire books. Please, we want you to. And I will lay money that no 2 of us do it the same way. I use Catholic philosophy and a role-playing game system to basically discuss the hows and whys of vampires, and because my family is a medical background, I throw in metaphysical microbiology just for fun. But my vampires are different from Sherilyn Kenyon's vampires, which are Greek mythology, the vampires of Lindsay Sands, which are Atlantean nanotechnology, and those are just the ones I can think of off the top of my head. We could probably go through the rest of the list as we go down the path.
No, it is interesting. There is a vampire probably for every generation. Going back, of course, we've always talked about Bram Stoker's. He may not have been the first, but he's a good starting point for a lot of people. And if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, you can read a lot of theories about how that Dracula story was actually a story about immigration from Eastern Europe and the fears that people had of Eastern Europeans coming. That's pretty relevant still to this day. These themes, these central themes, are things that people have explored for many generations. As far as I want to explain a little bit about the Twilight phenomenon of the early, mid to early 2000s, because a lot of people don't understand it. A lot of people are like, oh, Twilight's crap, it's so stupid, blah, 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 teeny buffer. But I think that it really captured something for people, whether they're other teens or even adult women, of course, at the time. And I think what it was for teen girls was that imagine this guy who's like immortal, all powerful, amazing, super hot, and yet he has nothing better to do than sit at your bedside at night and watch you sleep. A little creepy, thinking back. But for a teenage girl, that's magical because all the actual dudes at their school are like, playing Fortnite or not texting them back or into sports or whatever, and they don't have that like full devotion of this amazing best guy ever has been waiting thousands of years for you to come along and you're the special one. That's a powerful thing, and it really connected with people. So whether you enjoyed the quality of writing or whatever, you could argue that all day, but it captured something, a cultural zeitgeist, and it really spawned a lot of different great books. So don't dismiss Twilight. Well, it's just because I always go on these kind of panels and people, the first thing I want to do is like, my vampires don't sparkle, ha ha ha. And it's like, it's an easy, cheap shot. It is. I've said it before. I'm not going to lie. But it's, looking back with some hindsight now, I see how many boats rose with that, how many books and authors were able to come, up through the ranks because of that. We got a lot of talent because of that. And so I'm grateful for Stephanie Meyer and her books.
Well, it's like the Harry Potter phenomenon. Anything that turns people onto reading is good. But going back to Dracula, it's also one of the first techno thrillers. So there are a lot of things that made it such a touchstone. But I think that another thing has the ubiquitousness of the vampire myth in every different culture, however many kinds of them. We are obsessed with horror, with the idea of death and immortality, and vampires combine that. They didn't used to be set, but also like Jennifer was talking about, the adaptability is you can take them, and since the rules are simple, then it's really easy to make spin-offs of those rules and update it and change it. And vampires, even today, the idea of them, they kind of ignite the imagination, and anything that can ignite the imagination of a reader is also likely to ignite the imagination of readers, because guess what, we're also readers. That's the gift and the curse of the writer. You read something and you're like, that was really cool. It's not how I would have done it. And then so you write your version.
I want to just hop on what Mary said. I think that the Twilight phenomenon is wonderful. I mean, people can say whatever they like about it, but I love the books, I love the movie, and I was way over 30 when they all came out. Although my vampires don't sparkle, but they sure as hell look good in moonlight. So yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. I think the thing with vampires is that one of the things as human is that we all have a fear of some sort of death. Death is a standard concern for most of us. And with vampires, you take away one of the basic understandings of fear and cautiousness and the thing that shapes us. Because vampires don't have that. They don't die. So for me, one of the things I love is, well, if they can't die, what are they afraid of? What are their limitations? And that, to me, that's how you start building the rules. But I think that's fascinating for us as humans to think, what if we didn't have to worry about death?
And here comes the person who basically makes the Twilight jokes repeatedly and writes a whole book about vampire rules, like lots of rules, and what they're afraid of, and how they adapt in the modern world. Because to me, I started with a question. If a vampire doesn't have a reflection, how does he comb his hair? Like, modern hygiene is a lot more important than it was, a few hundred years ago. You can't go into you can't get a girl if you're all skeevy. So I had to build in, they have assistants, but they have to have rules for dealing with humans because they're different. And I decided magic, nah, we don't need any magic. We'll just make them giant colonial bacteria, because that's hot. And then when you take out the sexiness and the fear of death, because it's pretty easy to kill a vampire. They're allergic to cellulose, you stake them in the heart, they're dead. I don't know, it was a flip on the dynamic, and I'm really sorry, Stephanie, I love that you wrote books, and I admire everything you did, but I did glitter bombs and vampires as a joke on purpose. Yeah, I did that.
two vampire novels that I've written so far. There's a book called Dark Road to Paradise that I initially wrote as my thesis for my MFA back in 2000. So it was before I'd written that before Twilight came out. I was sort of very influenced by Bram Stoker originally, and even more than that, Anne Rice. And so what I was dealing with was how was I going to make my vampires different from Anne and from what Bram Stoker had done? Because I love a lot of things about Anne Rice's books. I love the Vampire Chronicles in general, but I didn't think the idea of vampires that were oftentimes hundreds and hundreds of years old, or in some cases even a couple of thousand years old, I didn't find that very relatable. So I didn't want any multiple millennia or even multiple 100-year-old vampires in my books. So the main protagonist of Dark Road to Paradise is a vampire who is only 50 years old in vampire time, fairly young. He was 26 when he was turned, and so you get this experience of a young vampire. I think to go back to the original question, or to the question we're all addressing, I think what makes vampires perennially fascinating for everyone is that they're the most human of the monsters. We're all fascinated by monsters because we're all fascinated by the dark sides of ourselves. We're fascinated with vampires because we're afraid of our own common mortality, and they found a way around that. And they look like us, at least in most cases. I mean, there are some cases where, like Nosferatu and some of those where they don't look like us, and that's fascinating for other reasons, because we're all fascinated with things that aren't so pretty too. So vampires hit us on a lot of primal levels: the fear of death, and the allure of being able to live forever. So vampires are always going to be with us. People in the publishing industry, I think, talk about, oh, vampires are passe, that's so 1990s, or that's so 2000. Just give us another couple of years, we'll write some more vampire books and people will be talking about it again.
Okay, so now let's get to the difference between the traditional and the contemporary. In the description of the panel, it says the depictions of vampires have evolved over time. So my question is, how would you say that your vampires fit a contemporary rather than a traditional world? What is it about your vampires that makes them contemporary, different from things that we've seen in the past? So we'll start there and just work our way back to that.
Well, when I wrote Dark Road to Paradise, one of the things, like I was just saying, one of the things I had to decide was what I was going to keep from the mythology, the more traditional side of the mythology, and what I was going to get rid of. I wanted to get rid of all the more supernatural, not all the more supernatural trappings, but the more superstitious trappings. There's no fear of crosses. There's no fear of running water. I wanted to boil everything down to sunlight and blood, basically. And I don't know how many people have actually read Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. I'm not talking about Dracula movies. Okay, so we know that Bram Stoker had Dracula going outside in the daylight. He didn't turn to dust in the daylight. That only happened when Christopher Lee and Hammer Films came into the picture. That wasn't even Bela Lugosi. So right away I wanted to get into the idea of a vampire who could be out in daylight. And one of the modern things about my vampire, Martin Cabot, in Dark Road to Paradise, is he teaches English, he teaches night school at a university. He assimilates into human society as much as he can, because one of the other things I did was I wanted to use human beings as not only a source of physical food, and blood does play a part, but also the vampire and the human. The human is sort of a conduit for constant connection to the mortal world. They can't exactly go back to being immortal, but one of the reasons why vampires choose certain humans to feed off of is they can sense their memories, and if they like what's there in their memories, they would choose to feed off of someone whose memories they're attracted to, as well as the idea of feeding off of their blood. So that's one thing I would think that my particular take on vampires, it's one of the things that brings it into modernity in a way that I didn't see anyone else doing at the time.
My vampires have texting addiction. conversations, and there's actually a plot point where they have to get their phone service turned off because, you know, immortals, they don't have a sense of having to pay T-Mobile. No, I mean, for me, vampires, a lot of it started with like the World of Darkness RPG. Hey, I'm a kid of the 90s. A lot of Buffy, a lot of anime. And what happened was, as I said, I took a lot of the sexiness out of vampires. And they're foodies. Like, they have their own version of like the Food Network. Like, oh, people from America taste like foie gras and GMO corn. You know, they have arguments like you would have at home, like, should we go to the farmer's market? Those people are probably organic. Yeah. Did I mention I write comedy, or was it? And then someone asked me to write magical vampires, and I had no idea what to do. But yeah, a lot of, I think where my vampires are modern is that they really struggle, and they keep people around like, okay, could you tell us how to do these things? Because we don't want to be left alone. They're basically, well, they're parasites. And I love the psychology of a parasite. They have to constantly adapt and be modern. Oh yeah, and I made King Arthur a vampire. Just because, you know, everything else was modern. Why not?
I have vampires of varying ages. All my vampires are all in the same coven. And what I like is that you have vampires who are old. And you know how people are, like, as you get older, you get stuck in the age or the came of age. Like, I'm a kid of the 80s. You know, I will always be a kid of the 80s. And so for me, vampires are the same way. Whenever it was you returned, you know, that's where your area of reference is. So I love the idea that vampires have to struggle because they're 200 years old, and what was, you know, hip and happening 200 years ago is not now. So the whole texting thing is hilarious.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and mine, my oldest vampires continuously have the struggle of these damn phones. They just do not, you know, they don't like modern technology, but they know they have to do it because the other aspect of that is humans have become more aware. You know, we, like, if you're in the society that we're in now, it's very hard to stay hidden like you could 200 years ago because the ability to communicate, you know, the ability to see, hygiene is actually very important. I'm always like, where do they shower? Where do they pee? Like, I have, you know.
Do vampires pee in your world?
They use the restroom, but we don't talk about what they do.
I can't talk about the fluids in my vampires.
I talk about the fluids.
You probably don't want to know.
Wait, don't you have like hypnotic,
Hallucinogenic vampire semen.
there we go.
Wow.
You want it to be comfortable on the piano, so
Yeah. We've gotten there.
we do. So I like the idea of how you get somebody who's 200 years old and has to live in our world and has to figure out a way, because they have to go out and feed. You know, like mine are not the Twilight and then they feed on animals, they feed on people. So how do you adapt that for somebody that is stuck in their world? I love that. That is a consistent theme.
Always tough to decide where you eat.
Yes.
I have to look down to remind myself of the question. But it's the similar to brain fart. At the start of the panel there, I also decided to write about vampires that weren't all that old. So, you know, the lead vampire in the Wood City series lived through World War II, was a very different person afterwards, and didn't even, at the start of the books, does not even know how he became a vampire. But, you know, when I read, like, the first time I read Anne Rice, I really dug it. Then I started going back through it, and I was like, why is everybody so whiny? I still like it. But, you know, life is really not all that bad for you, Louie. Get over it. You and the sausages, bang, you'll be fine. But, so I thought I would take my take on it, I'm going to say my like 15 times, sorry about that, would be that to make being a vampire very unpleasant, but to also has a main character who does not dwell on that, isn't bothered by that. It's just very matter of fact that, yeah, all our bodily fluids have been replaced by blood, You can continue to urinate if you want, but that's gross, it's a waste of food. Also makes you want to not think about the sex part too closely. But then again, if you're a vampire, you like blood, so it's not a problem. I also decided he wouldn't be a necrophiliac, so he doesn't like sleeping with other vampires, which is bad when your serial problem is young ladies who want to be vampires, who think that you'll be vampires together forever, and then they become a vampire, and you tell them that you're not going to be interested in them when they are. And then they are one, and then you're like, yeah, okay, so like I told you, I don't like dead people, so. But, and it's a similar thing with the, we're dealing a lot with, at the time we were dealing with a lot of people, Alzheimer's was coming up a lot, so I gave my vampire early onset Alzheimer's. So he doesn't have a really good memory, and talking about the modernity, in one of the books, he has a plan, but in order to keep track of it, he has to have somebody build him an app. And so his app is on all the time listening to him, and when he starts off playing, his phone starts vibrating. He's like, what? Why is my phone vibrating? He looked down. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to be doing this. Well, I screwed that up. Okay. No, everybody stop fighting. I'm supposed to do something different. Anyway, I write comics too. But that's enough about me.
So in my Blood Time and Vampire series, in the first book, Boys That Bite, also comedic, I was watching a lot of Buffy at the time, though my love for vampires did go back to more like Anne Rice. I think that was my introduction, but it is very gloomy. Whereas I just love the modern sensibility and humor in Buffy, and so I wanted to kind of write something inspired by that. And so in Boys That Bite, there's two twin sisters, Sunshine and Rain. Heavy parents, what are you gonna do? So Sunshine's just kind of a normal high school kid, and Rain is the goth girl, and she loves everything dark, and she's really wanted to be a vampire for a long time, and she's hooked up with this coven. And she's networked, she's been on a waiting list, she got her vampire certification, she got blood tested, and she's ready. And the night she's going to be bitten by her new bloodmate, who's going to be her eternal partner, he accidentally bites her twin sister instead, because they're identical. And now Sunny, who has no idea that the vampire world even exists, gets thrust into this whole thing against her will 1 week before prom, which is a problem. But my vampires are extremely modern. They live amongst us in the modern world, even if you don't know them, like you don't know that they're vampires. It's not an open world like True Blood, it's a closed world. They can't just go around sucking people dry, because the police would start thinking there's a serial killer or whatever. And so they have licensed donors, which they pay to, give blood. They are tested and everything's a great job for single moms, because you can be home in time for the kid to get out of school. And so we play a lot with that kind of thing. And there certainly are vampires who don't adjust. I love with Anne Rice and her later books about how Lestat just doesn't know how to use the freaking iPhone. And I do think there's some, things about that. Or like vampires who don't want to be living anymore. And that big conundrum of like, do you want to become a vampire? Do you want to outlive all your family and friends and everything like that? That's a huge question that they have to face all the time. I think it's really fun to pit vampires in a society. I think True Blood and Charlotte Harris's original series did that really well. I think Buffy does it really well, and it's fun to play with.
When I started writing, I wanted to use all the mythology and fill in some gaps in the middle. My first exposure to vampires was actually Fred Saberhagen. The Holmes Dracula file, the Dracula tape, where Dracula is the protagonist, and in most cases, he is the first-person point-of-view protagonist. So I wanted all of Dracula, and I was getting tired of, oh look, I am a vampire. I am immune to your holy water, to your crosses. It's like, okay, I am tired of this. Screw you, Blade. But on the other hand, I also wanted vampires to have free will. And okay, so like I said earlier, I wound up stealing from philosophy. Thomas Aquinas, I'm going to keep this under 5 minutes. I'm going to not do the lecture, but basically there was an idea that post-resurrection, a human person has total and complete control over the body to the point where they can manipulate molecules to slide through solid objects. And I figured, well, gee, if they could do that, then shapeshifting shouldn't be too hard, right? Like mist or bats. So vampires became an imperfect resurrection. And the more acts one commits, for good or ill, the tighter the soul becomes intertwined with the body, therefore the more powerful the vampire. And of course, human beings being what they are, I figured, you give them a whole bunch of powers, a lot of them are going to become jerks. One of my vampire protagonists goes to confession a lot, at which point the only comment the vampire has is, why yes, it does hurt, thank you for asking. And I also wanted history with my vampires. I'm a historian by training, so I wound up giving a vampire an entire CV from, okay, served in World War I, check, served in OSS, check, World War II, of course, CIA until mid-90s, and go on from there. And of course, since I was using metaphysical microbiology, since vampirism is a virus on more levels than one, I get into some of that, and using, for food, it's, well, expired blood means good for vampires. We just spike it with the vodka because it tastes expired. But that way you still get your human blood and you're good. But the preservatives, boy, do they suck.
Okay, so my next question is, do you feel restricted at all because you are writing this supernatural, presumably with some kind of powers, creature into a modern world where you have to kind of make them real, you have to make them believable, you have to make them something that can fit in with the things that are going on in current life and with current with people around them, things like that. Are there any restrictions that you found in writing your stories, or have you figured out, if you figured out a way around it, what have you figured out to make them, to give them their powers and their abilities, but still keep them able to be in the modern world with current people and situations? Go ahead.
Well, that's where, for me at least, that's where the idea of stripping back a lot of the folklore, like running water or them living in fear of crosses and things like that, that's where that comes in. If you have a creature who is a former, let's say former human, they were human at one point, and at this point they basically changed their diet, and my vampires aren't exactly what one would call walking cadavers. I mean, they're dead, but